Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Inshallah, everyone's having a good day. I'm a Palestinian, so this is a very important topic to me. Alhamdulillah. I'm very honored to be here and talk to you guys today about the history of Zionism and its impact on Palestine, as well as its impact on the Middle East and Islam in general, to be honest. But inshallah, we'll start with just simply what exactly is Zionism and what its history is. So before we get into exactly what Zionism is as an individual idea or an individual ideology in political terms, we should discuss exactly what the grander idea is, which is colonialism, or in specific, settler colonialism. So, settler colonialism is the process by which a foreign people invade a territory under the oversight of an imperial power. In most situations, it's typically by a power that is significantly stronger, more technologically advanced, has more political influence, more capabilities, things at its disposal in order for it to establish settlements and a power dynamic as a part of a larger colonial project that involves the necessary displacement of an indigenous population. An indigenous population is a population of people who are native to a region or to a land. So, as we all know, the Native Americans of the United States are the indigenous people of America. And we know that the United States was a settler colonial project that was established as a colonial project to kick out the Native Americans, essentially take over the Americas as the land of the English. And we all know how that ended up, the War of Independence and such. But in the case of Palestine, the colonization was carried out with the oversight of the British, who facilitated the creation of Israel, as promised by the Balfour Declaration. So we'll get into the Balfour Declaration and the details, but the process took place as a part of a larger colonial project that necessitates the displacement of the native people. So this project could not have been successful, and it wouldn't have been able to be a reality had they not made sure that a big part of the project was kicking the Palestinians or the native people out of the region. That's the only way it was possible. We'll get more specific into the context of all of this when we get into the Nakba, like Rahim was talking about. But this displacement looks like the forced expulsion of around, or more than actually, 750,000 Palestinians from their homes, which is now, with them leaving and such, is around 6 million in diaspora. Diaspora is essentially native people who are now kicked out of their nation, living multiple places around the world. Now, I know these words can feel a bit abstract and historical, but the process of settler colonialism is not something bound to a specific moment in time. It's an ongoing process that has to sustain itself in order to achieve a goal of conquest and ownership. So for Israel maintains itself as a settler colony through what social scientists call the logic of elimination, like how they get rid of the indigenous Palestinian population. Is there a case of settler colonial force that wasn't hostile towards the natives they encountered? No. All settler colonial projects are by nature supposed to be hostile towards the people who live there and the original owners of the land. Otherwise, no one's going to be willing to give up their history, their culture, their land, their farmland, all these things that they have raised and grown as a part of their history. They're not going to be willing to give that to them without being forced off of it. So that's what settler colonialism is. Now, settler colonialism operates is through three tactics. We call these tactics the logic of elimination. And the logic of elimination is the many different tactics and strategies used to dispossess indigenous people of their territories. So there are three phases to logical elimination. It starts with confrontation, it goes to carceration, and it goes to erasure. So confrontation is, as it says here, the massacre and executions or assassinations of people who are dissenters. So people dissenting in war or in politics in general is when a politician who has major power, who has major influence, the most influential, has people who disagree with him. So in the case of Nazi Germany, for example, there was Hitler, and then the people who countered Hitler, he would arrest them. We know about the Holocaust and such. In, for example, the USSR, Stalin would arrest his dissenters. And then obviously in Israel, any Palestinian who is outspoken, and I'm sure we've seen some footage where Palestinians hold flags, and Palestinian flags where it's illegal, and that is considered a form of dissent. So the way they deal with them is through mass murder, executions, and assassination. Some as far as using terrorist tactics in order to make sure that it was done. And then it moves on to carceration. And carceration is the forced removal of reservations and environmental changes. So in this situation, there could be a mosque that is very, very historically important, and because of its historical importance, it attracts a lot of Palestinians. We know of one similar mosque. So what do we do to this mosque? We stop all the people from praying. We would go to this mosque and we would make it incredibly difficult for anyone to reach this mosque. We would put checkpoints around it. We could establish guarded neighborhoods of settler regions around this mosque so that way Palestinians or people who are against us can't then make it easily towards this. And then the last phase of it all is erasure. So this mosque, instead of it now being hard to get there, we destroy it completely. It doesn't exist. And then we reject any idea of it ever having existed in the first place. So when these three phases are complete, we essentially set up a playing field in which we can dictate the future of the region and dictate whether or not the history that people believe is true is in fact true or not. So for some examples of these, for confrontation, there was Deir Yassin, the massacre of Deir Yassin. There was a continuous bombing of Gaza that is happening today. There's Khan al-Ahmar village, which was torn over 5 times, or I think now 5 times. For carceration, there's the mass arrest of Palestinian youth, like as we saw in Sheikh Jarrah. There's the taking over of land using the Jewish monetary fund or Jewish land fund, as we'll talk about in a minute. There's the confines of Palestinian to small swaths of land in the West Bank. So how we see a lot of refugees in Gaza and refugees in the West Bank who are from the pre-1948 lines. And then for examples of erasure, the denying the Palestinian identity. So we are not allowed to acknowledge being Palestinian because that's counteracting to the Israeli colonial project. Claiming our cultural heirlooms like the kufiya, I'm sure we all know the kufiya, how it looks, the white and black scarf that is of Palestinian culture. Now it's being claimed. There's hummus, there's falafel. It's also being claimed as Israeli dishes. And we understand that these actions are not a momentary bad thing Israel does, but it's rather the foundation of Israel as a country. It was built through dispossessing Palestinians. And in order to maintain itself as a state, it must continue to eradicate the Palestinian people. So what is Zionism? We said that Zionism is a colonial project, but we have to get into actually what Zionism is as a specific colonial project. So Zionism, from the standpoint of its supporters, is the national movement from the return of the Jewish people to their homeland and the resumption of Jewish sovereignty in the land of Israel. But from the standpoint of its victims, in this very specifically the Middle Easterners, Palestinians, and Lebanese, Zionism, from the standpoints of its victims, are a settler colonial movement whose goal was the establishment of a Jewish state on the ruins and ethnic cleansing of the Palestinian people. So now that we've talked a little bit about the character of settler colonialism, we can go into Zionism. Thinking back to the previous slides, it's important to remember that what we're dealing with is a real-life situation in which Palestinians are living under the constant threat of home demolition, arbitrary arrest, and land theft. Where Zionism, from the standpoint of its supporters, are basically saying, who would disagree with us? The problem is it's an ideal. It's an ideal. Like, this is something that has to be like the ideal situation for people of the Jewish faith and of the Jewish ethnicity. And you can't argue with ideals because they're very specifically meant for the Jewish ethnicity. But from the standpoint of its victims, it reflects the application of Zionism through in daily life. But this is also expanded upon by Zionism's historical development. What we mean by that is this. So the roots of Zionism, it's actually significantly further back than 1896. There's a lot of history that goes into it that talks about economic matters, talks about matters of wealth disparity and manipulation of wealth, but that's something that's really, really deep and requires a lesson in of itself. But the actual Zionist movement that we know today in Congress, in Israel, and its impact on the UN, and its impact on global affairs was established by this man here on the right side. In 1896, Zionism was founded by Theodor Herzl in the book, The Jewish State by Theodor Herzl. He actually used this book to then establish a lot of influence within the Jewish community as well as the grander European community, because there was a lot of dissent problems within the Jewish community and the Europeans in general. So Theodor Herzl brought forth this idea of establishing a nation for the Jewish people in one of 3 countries, in either Uganda, Argentina, or Palestine. The reason he was thinking of establishing the state was because there was, obviously we know of the religious justification for Israel, but there was also the socioeconomic reason. So we know that the Jews, for a long time, up until this point, were living in ghettos in the regions of Europe. So there was a lot of prejudice towards being a Jewish person in Europe. So for a lot of Jewish people, it was really important for them to kind of find an identity to want to be a part of, which was in this situation Zionism, or which eventually grew to being Israel. But people think that Zionism arose after the Holocaust, but the idea of Zionism predates that and has its roots in the 18th to 19th century. They think it started after World War II, but it's significantly earlier. First early Zionist settlements scattered whenever, like I said, there was a lot of dissent between Europeans and the Jews. But things took a turn in 1896 and became a lot more serious whenever the Jewish Congress was established with Theodor Herzl. By the way, on a side note, Herzl was an atheist. So he uses these religious justifications as to why it's important for Israel to exist for the religious reasonings, using rabbinical understanding, which is understanding from the perspective of rabbis, the Talmudic understanding, the Torah. But he didn't believe in any of these. He in fact used them to manipulate the course of history. And then, like I said, the Jewish Congress established, where they started bringing up the idea of which nation they would want to establish Israel in, and they were looking at Uganda, Argentina, or Palestine. So there, from the beginnings of Zionism, there wasn't a real tangible motive for it to be Palestine beyond it having some sort of kind of religious tie to Israel. As we know, the first and second temple, Solomon and David. But it's incredibly important to recognize that they were considering Argentina and Uganda because of the fact that the basis of Zionism was not established on Jewish religious practices, but was actually established on settler colonialist, atheistic, secular practices. So although it's defended with religion, it's actually from its roots not a religious movement. So this is the roots of Zionism continue. Like I said, the first Zionist Congress was established in 1897. It established the goals of organized settlements of Jewish laborers in Palestine, establishment of Zionist institutions, and the consent of world governments to allow for colonization. And as I said, they considered Uganda and Argentina as possible areas to settle, but they ultimately chose Palestine for strategic purposes, which we'll discuss in a minute, as well as for, like we said, the underlying religious purposes to give it legitimacy. So Zionism is a political project, not a religious one, as we discussed. It emphasized Uganda and Argentina were potential spots, but they chose Palestine because of the religious significance, to grant them legitimacy, which goes to show it's, like I said, in root, it is only a settler colonialist project. They were willing to do it anywhere, but they decided on Palestine for the purpose of legitimacy because of the religious tie, as well as it was incredibly strategic at the time to want to establish a Western foothold in the Muslim empire that had so much influence and control over history for such a long period of time. But we'll continue into that later, like I said. In 1881, in response to the rampant anti-Semitism that came out from the settlements that were facilitated in Palestine, they basically put 20 Jewish settlements that were largely seen as unsuccessful because the settlers were too dependent on Palestinian labor. So they essentially went to Palestine and after they established the Palestinian or as Jewish settlements in Palestine. And obviously because of the fact these were foreign invaders entering the region of Palestine, the Palestinians were not comfortable, people who lived in the region of Palestine, because it wasn't called Palestine yet. It was known more so as Palestinian Syria or Syriac Palestine. There's a specific term because it was a state within the Ottoman Empire. But they essentially decided, because of this level of anti-Semitism, that the only way to counteract this anti-Semitism was in fact establishing more Jewish settlements. But because of the fact that it was a new colonialist idea, they didn't have laborers to work for them in these settlements to continue and be completely efficient. So what they had to do was they had to bring Palestinian laborers. The problem with that, however, is when you rely too much on the labor of the natives are already not comfortable with the idea of foreign invaders there. So ultimately these initial settlements failed. And because of these practices, because this happened more than once, it laid out exactly the plans for making Zionism into an organized movement and recommended the creation of institutions like the Jewish National Fund. And out of this, the first Zionist Congress came, which established the direct goals of the Zionist movement and established several of the institutions recommended by Herzl, which then established many, many strands. One of them, which is a very big name that we know, is called the Mossad. And this, just to summarize, it's something colonial. In a letter to Cecile Rhodes, Herzl writes, "You are being invited to help make history. It doesn't involve Africa, but a piece of Asia Minor. Not Englishmen, but Jews. How then do I happen to turn to you, since this is an out-of-the-way matter for you? How indeed? Because it is something colonial. You, Mr. Rhodes, are a visionary politician or a practical visionary. I want you to put the stamp of your authority on the Zionist plan and to make the following declaration to a few people who swear by you." So from the start, they acknowledged that it was a colonial. Now we get into the Jewish National Fund. This is where things really started to take place in Palestine, where the Zionist movement really started to get its foothold in there. So the Jewish National Fund was founded in 1901 to buy and develop land in Ottoman Syria. Oh, so it was Ottoman Syria, which was Palestine, was part of the grander state. Jewish ownership during the period of the British Mandate was no more than 3.5 million dunams. I'm not exactly sure what the calculation of a dunam is. We can figure that out after. And Israel had taken control of about 20 million dunams by the end of 1948. So already there's a substantial increase in how much land they own. Numbering over 90,000 in 1947, the Palestinians of the Naqab owned and controlled 99% of the Naqab lands and constituted 99% of the population. So the vast majority, compared to the now 10% of controlled lands and 13% of the population. So the displacement of the Palestinians and the ethnic cleansing has been incredibly successful. They've been doing it very well, and it's been incredibly impactful. We see that 90,000 Palestinians made up 99% of the Naqab lands, own 99% of the lands, and were 99% of the population. But compared to now, it's 10%. That's a 90% decrease from the indigenous population. And most of the land controlled by the JNF and the state of Israel was unjustly taken away by the majority of the Palestinians to begin with, those who were expelled in the 1948 Naqab. One of the prominent results from this was the drastic change that occurred in respect to the control of the land in Palestine. The military occupation of territory on one hand and the expulsion and forced displacement of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians from their land on the other led to effective Israeli control over the majority of the land in the newly established state. While the amount of land under Jewish ownership during the period period of British mandate was no more, like I said, no more than 3.5 million dunhams. It was eventually grew to 20 million. It's incredible, honestly. In other words, Israel had undertaken measures which amount to the acquisition of territory by force, which is strictly prohibited under international law. Both its legislative and judicial system have played a central role in this context. It's also important to note that Israel, the Jewish National Fund, actually used terrorism to influence a lot of Palestinians to be willing to give up their land. So these were a couple quotes discussed from Joseph Waltz and Arthur Balfour. Arthur Balfour was the head of the Balfour Declaration, and Joseph Waltz was one of the creators of the Jewish National Fund. They both say, for Arthur Balfour, in Palestine, we do not propose even to go through the form of consulting the wishes of the present inhabitants of the country. So already within the first sentence of the phrase, he says, it's not even our goal to care what the Palestinians want. The four great powers are committed to Zionism, and Zionism is rooted in the age-long tradition. In present needs, in future hopes for a profounder import than the desire and prejudices of 700,000 Arabs who now inhabit the ancient land. Arthur Balfour was also a known anti-Semite. He hated Jews. It must be clear that there is no room for both people in this country. No development will bring us closer to our aim to be an independent people in this small country. If the Arabs leave the country, it will be broad and wide open for us. And if the Arabs stay, the country will remain narrow and miserable. The only solution is Eretz Israel without Arabs. Now this is where things really begin. This is where things really take a turn in the grander scheme of history, with the start of World War I and the fall of the Ottoman Empire. So we all know that the Ottoman Empire was the strongest empire for the course of around 500 to 600 years. It expanded from Eastern Europe, from the regions of Chechnya, Bosnia, or not even Bosnia, a little bit more to the east of Bosnia, but all the way to North Africa and to West Asia, and then some parts of Europe. The Ottoman Empire was absolutely a monster in terms of the influence they had for a large majority of their history, as well as a place of scientific marvels. A lot of people would travel to Damascus and Baghdad to try to learn about the science the Ottomans had discovered. But everything started coming to an end more so towards the middle of the 1800s. That's where the fall of the Ottoman Empire really started beginning, but the impact was the most during World War I. And what started World War I? So for a little bit of backstory, World War I had a lot of ally ships that were splitting up Europe. For one, there was the Austro-Hungary, Germanic, and Ottoman ally ship, which would at the start had Italy. And then there was also the British, French, Serbian, and Russian ally ship. Essentially, these ally ships were literally made just in case any war were to establish these one side or the other. And as we know, one side ended up declaring war on the other. So the spark that ignited World War I was struck in Sarajevo, Bosnia, where Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated. He was the heir to the throne for Austria-Hungary. Convinced that Austria-Hungary was ready for war because of the assassination, Serbians assumed that Austrians declare war on Serbia and try to take it as their own. The Serbians then ordered the Serbian army to mobilize and appeal to Russia for assistance. So they went to go to speak to their allies in order to try to get some military backing against the larger nation, which was Austria-Hungary. And at the start of World War I, the Ottoman Empire, like I said, was already in decline. And they entered the war in 1914 on the side of the Central Powers, including Germany and Austria-Hungary, and was defeated in 1918 later on. The reason the Ottoman Empire was on the sides of German and Austria-Hungary's side was because of the influence of the British and the French in North Africa. Up until this point, there was a lot of intention for the British and the French to try to colonialize Northern Africa and take advantage of the resources that were available for them there. So that had already rubbed off negatively on the Ottoman Empire. And considering the Ottoman Empire was in decline, they had to maintain their strength and they had to try to establish some growth. So in this circumstance, the best side for them to have joined was for them to join the German and Austro-Hungary. And during the war, Britain had been a major sponsor of Arab nationalist thought and ideology, primarily as a weapon to use against the power of the empire. And this is an incredibly important point. So we all know about the modern borders of Palestine, Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Egypt. These borders didn't exist prior to 1918. These borders were all one unanimous empire with no borders that you could go cross from Quds, go to Damascus, from Damascus, go to Cairo, and then from Cairo, go to Casablanca. You know, you could do all of that without having to worry about whether or not someone was going to stop you at a checkpoint. But how did they stop this? How did they make it to where people were willing willing to put borders between themselves? Well, that's easy. You have to establish a sense of individual identity. You have to establish a sense of individuality. So that's what the British did. They sponsored Arab nationalism, which is what brought the idea of the pan-Arab nationalist movement, to then fight the Turkish rulers of the Ottoman Empire. They started meddling with the relationships of the Arabs and the Turkish. They started meddling with the relationships of the religious sects. They started meddling with the relationships of different tribalist leaders in order to try to get them and motivate them into having a dislike towards the idea of a supranationalist ideology. In this situation, Islam is a supranationalist ideology because it supersedes the nations. It supersedes my individual identity. At the end of the day, beyond my Arab speech, beyond my brown hair and my brown eyes, I am a Muslim and I submit myself to Allah. So this identity is what allowed for the Ottoman Empire to become the superpower that it was at the time. But this all came crashing down after Sharif Hussein rebelled against the Ottoman rule during the Arab Revolt in 1916. In August, he was replaced by Sharif Haidar, but in October, he proclaimed himself King of Arabia, and in December was recognized by the British as an independent ruler. When he was recognized by the British as an independent ruler, this was incredibly important because this essentially told the rest of the world, we are going to militarily and economically back this man for him to establish a new identity within the region of the Ottomans. And the Sharif Hussein is this guy right here. And following the armistice of Mudros, which was essentially the treaty, the most Ottoman empire territories were divided between Britain, France, Greece, and Russia. This man here, his name is Thomas Edwards Lawrence. They call him Lawrence of Arabia. He was essentially head of espionage, which is spying, against the Ottomans, and convinced the Arabs to then revolt against the Ottoman Empire. So the Arab Revolt began in 1916, and it had a few successes, but the real risk was that the Ottoman Empires, like the reason that they needed it to happen, they were worried that the Ottoman forces would advance along the coast of the Red Sea and they would recapture Mecca. So on 16th of 1916, in October, the 16th of October 1916, Lawrence was sent to the Hijaz on an intelligence gathering mission led by Ronald Stewart. He interviewed Sharif Hussein's son, Ali, Abdullah, and Faisal, and concluded that Faisal was the best candidate to lead the revolt. How did he conclude this? Because he was the most willing to be a traitor, essentially. Was willing to betray the Islamic identity, and the identity of a super identity, and was more worried about having his own power, his own plot of land, and as such was willing to betray the Ottomans. So as a result, they made him the leader of the revolution. And in November, Newcomb was assigned to lead a permanent British liaison to Faisal's staff. So essentially, they gave him a piece of the British army with no less than 100,000 men, and they began their march on the Ottoman Empire. And they used guerrilla warfare tactics by bringing the Ottomans to fight the Arabs. The Arabs would then fight the Ottomans in the desert regions that they had lived in for long periods of time, which would then become a war of attrition. And because the Arabs were so used to the desert regions, the Ottomans would lose men. Eventually, the Ottomans lost their capabilities of defending the region of the Red Sea. And what they did was the British, they sent the Arab dissenters, revolters, to a fort, which I'm not sure of the name, in the regions of the Red Sea. And they dismantled these forts from the inside out and brought in the Royal Navy to then send all their troops into the regions of Palestine as well as Jordan and Saudi Arabia. And from there, it was history. That was the first time, I think, ever where the Ottoman Empire was attacked from the Red Sea in the heart of their empire. Soon after, this is right as the whites, the British, were celebrating their victory, their eminent victory, they decided to create the Balfour Declaration. This was in 1917 as well. So like we said, the Ottoman Empire officially fell in 1918. They were so confident in Zionism and so confident in the idea of taking Palestine that they actually made this declaration a year before the war's end. But they came out publicly, and James Balfour, who was an anti-Semite, he hated Jews. So he came out and he said, the four great powers are committed to Zionism, and Zionism, be it right or wrong, good or bad, is rooted in age-long traditions, in present needs, in future hopes, of far profounder import than the desires and prejudices of 700,000 Arabs who now inhabit that ancient land. Why is it far profounder and more important? Because the only way that the West can maintain the power structure that it developed post-World War I was by establishing a settler colonialist state in the heart of the Ottoman Empire that would then stop the Muslims or Arabs or any super identity from ever uniting again. And how did they do that? Well, through the use of Zionism. They were using the Jews as a tool, which is why it's now commonplace that we know that James Balfour was a Zionist simply for his anti-Semitic reasoning. He also had a book where he talked about how the Jews were destroying Europe, and he was trying to use Zionism to kick them out of Europe. Now now I think this is the most important part of all of this region of history. This part explains to you why the problems of the Middle East today exist as they do. This is the Sykes-Picot Agreement. Sykes-Picot was a secret agreement. It was done behind closed doors. It was a conspiracy. So we all know the term conspiracy theories. Conspiracy theories is where you believe that a group of people decided to make a plan behind closed doors without your knowing, when you think so. A conspiracy, without it being a theory, is whenever it's official and you know that it was the case. Sykes-Picot was a conspiracy. We know that it happened. We know the exact people who did it. We know exactly why they did it. And it was a conspiracy because it was done in secret behind closed doors between the Triple Entente. The Triple Entente were those of France, Russia, and England, the United Kingdom. So in 1916, a secret treaty between the United Kingdom and France, assistance from the Russian Empire and the Kingdom of Italy, to define their mutually agreed spheres of influence and control and eventual partition of the Ottoman Empire. So they basically put down the Middle Eastern map, and this is even a year before the Balfour Declaration. So they already knew that this was going to happen. They were so sure of it. And they basically took the Middle East and they drew a bunch of lines and made a bunch of borders, makeshift countries, as you see on the top right picture, this one right here. And they decided who was going to control what. So as you can see here, the region of Iraq was supposed to look like this, and that was supposed to be an Arab state run by Faisal Hussein, but it was under British protection. We all know that under British protection, the British actually ran it, but the Arabs pretended to. And then here was British rule strictly in the region of Kuwait. Here was under British, French, and Russian protection. This was supposed to be what the original Israel. Here was the Arab states under French protection. Here was complete French rule. So this is Arabs under French. This is complete French. This is also where we see Lebanon, the region of Lebanon, which is why the Lebanese also speak French. And then this is the Russian rule of Armenia. So Armenians, they look Russian. They have a lot of terminology that fits with the Russians. And then there's also Chechnya up here. But the agreement effectively divided the Ottoman provinces outside the Arabian Peninsula into areas of British and French control and influence. Basically, the simplest way for them to establish a colonialist project was by making people have different identities within a region where they all had the same identity. These people stopped liking these people. These people stopped liking these people. These people stopped liking these people. Everyone stopped liking each other the way they did before because of a simple idea that the British brought to us, which is mind-boggling. The agreement was initially directly as a basis for the 1918 Anglo-French modus vivendi, which provided a framework for the occupied enemy territory administration in the Levant. The Levant region is the region from here to northwestern Iraq to Syria to this region. So this is the Levant. Anyone who lives in this region is considered Levantine, as well as here. The borders of the Middle East were drawn during World War I by a Briton, which is a British person, Mark Sykes, and a Frenchman, François Picot. The two diplomats' pencils divided the map of one of the most volatile regions in the world into states that cut through ethnic and religious communities. This is incredibly important. Ethnic and religious communities. The Sykes-Picot Agreement also proposed an international administration for Palestine, which in 1920 was known as Mandatory Palestine under British control. Why is it so important that the ethnic and religious communities were cut through? So you see these borders up here. These borders, these right here, are the same borders if they were cut by ethnic lines. So these were Persians in this region right here. These were Persians who are now living in 3 different countries. And in these 3 different countries, they share an identity with, as a Kuwaiti, with Arabs, with Levantines, with people who were at the time of the Ottoman Empire without being borders. There are also people who came from other regions like Yemenites. So already in this small region, we have 4, 5, maybe 6 ethnicities and 4 different languages. How are people going to unite without Islam being the #1 unifier if they have 4 different languages and 3 different skin colors and 6 different eye colors? What is the possibility of them uniting? Of course, there's a possibility of them uniting over the course of 100, maybe 200 years, whenever these skin colors are then diluted and the eye colors are diluted and they all look the same. But that's 200 years of control from a colonialist, from people from a different region, from a different continent that have no idea what this continent really is like. So they used Sykes-Picot to split up these borders in order for these borders to be borders that are essentially impossible to reunite. And that's why Sykes-Picot is split up in the weird way that it's split up. And that's why the borders that we see today are the borders that we see today. Matter of fact, Iraq, God bless them, but Iraq is in a very, very tough situation because Iraq, I think, the most number of different ethnicities combined in a region with large percentages of each of them, which is why Iraq was very hard to take control of. And we saw a lot of violence there in the Iraq war prior with Saddam Hussein. And now finally, we have the British Mandate period. This is essentially the period that lasted the longest before 1948 and the establishment of Israel as an independent state. The British Mandate period was essentially a time where Palestine was a colony under England. So prior to then, like we saw, it was an international region for anyone to essentially want to live there, except for the people who have lived there for thousands of years. Anyone can live there except for that community. And they promised a state for the Jews inside this region. They essentially said that this region, like we saw earlier, the people who live there don't have a purpose for living there. It's significantly more important for the European Jews, by the way, not the Yemenites or the Moroccan Jews, the European Ashkenazi Jews, to live in Palestine. And nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. So we all know that's a lie. We all know that as a result of the settler colonialism, they use prejudice on the civil rights and religious rights of Palestinians, specifically non-Jewish Palestinians, in order to then establish the false state of Israel. And Muslim Christian associations were established to push back. So there was Fatah, there was one in Lebanon that I can't quite remember, but there was a lot of religious organizations that were both Muslim and Christian that were established to protect Palestine and protect the Palestinians. And they would meet in Jerusalem with the British rulers to try to figure something out. But at the end of the day, the military might of the British and the French was so overwhelming that they could not do much to fight back. They had hunting rifles that were used for cattle or for animals. These hunting rifles would do nothing against the planes and tanks of the British. Essentially, the Levant after World War I was Palestine and Jordan and Iraq, all were taken over by the British. Lebanon, Syria, or Blad al-Sham in general that were fractured, was taken over by the French. And there was a dramatic change in political, economic, and social life. It was the beginning of the British Mandate period. There were 27 Muslim Christian associations that were established in Palestinian towns between the August 1918 and December of 1918, the end of January 1919. At the end, their representatives held a national meeting in Jerusalem that is known as the First Palestinian National Congress. And the Palestinian National Congress sent delegates to the 1919 Paris Peace Conference to reject the Balfour Declaration and demand independence. And we know today that that demand was rejected and was in fact pushed back on until eventually World War II, where we see most of the majority of modern tactics of the settler colonialist movement are used. Now, that's it for me. That's as far as I got with the fall of the Ottoman Empire and the impact of the fall of the Ottoman Empire on the region of Palestine and Zionism's impact in that region. So, Jazakumullah khair for coming.